Hey guys, thanks for your show. I really appreciate it. I try to listen every day.
Thank you.
I have a friend that is a Protestant pastor, and we often have dialogue about the differences of our faith. And he recently gifted me with a book promoting Sola Scriptura, and it uses the church fathers to promote this teaching. And
What is the name of the
and I
book?
looked, um, I believe it's called like Church Fathers, why Sola Scriptura is true, and I forget the exact title, but it's kind of a long title.
So let me ask you a question.
But
The thesis that you just articulated, is there something about that thesis that strikes you as ironic?
Well, I think it's ironic that it's using Catholic saints that believed in the Catholic faith.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. So the irony here is that the argument of the book is that we can know that the doctrine of Sola Scriptura is true because it's taught by sacred tradition. Now that strikes me as very ironic, but I cut you off. I'm sorry. So I jumped the gun. That may not have been your question. Let me go back and let you finish the question.
Yeah, I mean, I found it extremely ironic that the first 150 pages are basically Catholic saints, and like the founding fathers of the Catholic Church that are, and using their words to say that, their words show the reality of Sola Scriptura. And I wanted to have just some talking points with him when I come back to him.
Yeah, sure. I can certainly help you with that. So one of them is I'd like you to engage this irony that we've identified. Here are a couple other things I'd like you to ask. So what in fact does the Protestant doctrine of Sola Scriptura affirm? What does it affirm? Well, in most formulations, it looks something like this. We should believe no dogma of the faith, no article of faith, unless that article of faith can be established by the express words of Scripture. That's generally, so there's no other authority on which we can base the content of Christian faith. If we're to identify something as an article of faith in the tradition, it ought to be grounded on the express words of Scripture. And it implies a coherent canon of the Bible. So when we say it has to be established by the express words of Scripture, they mean these 66 books, and they name them. So, for instance, if you look at the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is a standard Protestant confession of the Presbyterian tradition, it'll make this claim that you have to establish all doctrine on the express words of Scripture. And when we say Scripture, what we mean is Genesis through Revelation, 66 books, excluding the 7 books of the Deuterocanon. That's what they mean. All right, that's the doctrine. Now, here's my question. If that were true, well, is the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, as I've just articulated it, is that an article of faith in the Christian religion? Is it a revealed doctrine? Now, by your own test, by your own rule, all doctrines must be established by the express words of the Bible. Okay, so is the doctrine of Sola Scriptura that you've just articulated manifest in the 66 books that you've identified as the canon? And as soon as you raise the question, you realize that the answer is no. Absolutely not. So I would ask my Protestant friend, find me any or all texts of the Bible that say all Christian doctrines must be established by these 66 books. It's not there. It's not there. So the doctrine fails its own test of authority. It is inconsistent, it is incoherent, because the doctrine of Sola Scriptura cannot be established as an article of faith on the express words of Scripture. So that's number one. All right. Number two, and this is kind of a functional problem with Sola Scriptura. If you hold to the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, how do you, in principle, differentiate dogma from opinion? Let me tell you what I mean. Let us say that two Protestants read the Bible and they come up with divergent interpretations. All right? And so they understand some doctrine differently. How do you know, what principled means is there to determine whether their disagreement is substantive such that they have to break fellowship with one another? Like, this is a dogma, line in the sand, and I can't have fellowship with you because you're no longer an Orthodox Christian. How do they determine whether their disagreement rises to that level of significance? I would contend that the doctrine of Sola Scriptura gives you no principled way to answer that question. Because the problem is worse than that Protestants disagree with one another. It's worse than that. That's a fact. That's evident. They disagree. But we can't tell, based on the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, whether the disagreements that Protestants have with one another are substantive, whether or not they constitute a legitimate reason for church rupture. And look, Scripture commands us to be in agreement on everything. How do you know how to apply that rule if you're a Protestant? Let me give you an illustration of the difficulty. As just kind of an empirical fact, most evangelical Protestants today kind of hunker down and say the essentials of the faith are things like the atoning death of Christ and salvation by faith alone, and probably the doctrine of Sola Scriptura. If you got that, you got what you need. Well, how did they arrive at that list of essentials? Where'd that list come from? Why not other essentials? If you drive back into the 16th century and you look at the early history of Protestantism, that was not the position. Not the position. Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, and Cranmer too for that matter, but especially Luther and Calvin, believed that the nature of Christ's presence in the Eucharist was an essential article of faith in the Christian religion and absolutely necessitated excommunication or schism if you could not arrive in agreement. So, for example, Zwingli did not believe in the doctrine of the real presence. Luther did. And because Zwingli denied that doctrine, Luther considered Zwingli to be an instrument of the Antichrist.
Wow.
A servant of Satan, cut off from redemption and the household of God.
Ooh.
In 1541, I think it was, 41 or 43, Calvin wrote a book called A Little Treatise on the Lord's Supper, in which he also articulated the position that the nature of Christ's presence in the Eucharist was tant nécessaire au salut. That was his French phrase. So necessary for salvation. Ironically, he had a different interpretation from Luther, but he agreed that it was substantive and it was something over which the church had to split. No Protestant today that I know holds that point of view. Why not? Why not? The fact of the matter is they just will never agree on the nature of Christ's presence in the Eucharist, so they've given it up as an essential doctrine. Not for any principled reason, but just because they can't actually arrive at agreement, so they've quit trying. All right. So the doctrine of Sola Scriptura is incoherent. It's not functional. Like, it's abortive from the get-go because you can't even use it to arrive at an objective consensus about what the Christian faith is. And finally, Christ has revealed to us another rule of faith. Christ gave us a way to have this objective certainty in the act of faith, and what Christ gave us was the teaching authority of the Catholic Church.
Okay. Well, we thank you for your call, Dustin. It is called a communion here.